Buenas tardes. Es un placer esta tarde contar con la presencia de Amelia Jones como invitada dentro del ciclo Parlem. Amelia, thank you so much for being here with us. Dentro del ciclo Parlem, con motivo de la exposición de Fina Miralles, estamos enormemente satisfechos de poder tener la perspectiva de Amelia. Justo antes de empezar quisiera simplemente hacer unas indicaciones a nivel práctico. Para aquellos que nos están siguiendo en Zoom, pueden activar la traducción simultánea en la propia aplicación. Y por otra parte, quienes quieran formular preguntas, los que hagan el seguimiento por Zoom tienen una pestaña que es escribir preguntas y respuestas, y por otra parte quienes nos sigan hoy a través de YouTube lo pueden hacer, pueden escribir sus preguntas en el chat de YouTube y nosotros intentaremos en la medida de lo posible recogerlo todo. Bien, ante todo quisiera presentar a Amelia, si bien es una persona enormemente conocida dentro del mundo del arte. Amelia es profesora, vicedecana académica y de investigación en la Roski School de Arte y Diseño de la Universidad de Southern California, así como comisaria e investigadora de arte, performance y de estudios sobre feminismo y sexualidad. Es imposible enumerar todas sus publicaciones y artículos publicados, pero destacaría Seeing Differently, A History of Art Theory, a History and Theory of Identification and the Visual Arts, de 2012, Otherwise Imagining Queer Feminist Art Histories, coeditado con Erin Silver en 2016, y asimismo es editora de un número especial on Trans Performance que se publicó en Performance Research en 2016. Justamente acaba de comisariar la exposición retrospectiva Queer Communion Ron Athy, que se acaba de inaugurar en Participant en Nueva York y que también se presenta en ICA de Los Ángeles. Y la publicación que acompaña a esa exposición ha sido considerada por New York Times como uno de los mejores libros de arte del 2020. Por otra parte, justamente ahora también acaba de publicar In Between Subjects, A Critical Genealogy of Queer Performance en Routledge Press, que explora la historia de la performance y la teoría queer desde los años 50 a partir de la perspectiva feminista queer. Sin más, agradecer nuevamente la presencia de Amelia hoy con nosotros y darte paso a una pequeña introducción a partir de la cual pues, generará pues, un diálogo. Gracias, Amelia. Adelante. A partir de la cual pues, generará...
I still hear someone speaking.
Adelante.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Teresa and Macba, and thank you to Sylvia Pala for interpreting. I have a little bit of an issue because I hear the Spanish as well as the English equally loudly, so when we get to the Q&A, it might be difficult. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Teresa and Macba, and thank you to Sylvia Pala for interpreting. I have a little bit of an issue because I hear the Spanish as well as the English equally loudly, so when we get to the Q&A, it might be difficult. Yes, okay. Sorry. I think I've solved the problem. I did have the YouTube page, which was not on my screen, but it was, I could hear my own voice speaking. So very happy to be here. I will get started with a little PowerPoint. that I made up after reading the quite wonderful catalog for the exhibition and thinking about all the artists I know much more about. I was really, really thrilled to learn more about Fina Miralles, whose work I have known of, but didn't really know much about the context. So I'll get started here. And yeah, so Fina Miralles and the conceptual body, I have a kind of working idea that I've been thinking about a lot over the last decade. And I've published several articles introducing this concept of the conceptual body, which is a framework to understand and historicize the range of work in the 1960s and 1970s in which the artist deploys her or his body to explore conceptual issues or themes driven by political questions and energies. And I'm reading more about the context of the Franco regime and what was going on, particularly in the 60s and 70s in Spain and Catalonia. It really struck me that this concept applies in a very interesting way, but also can be shifted a little bit to accommodate what is specific about this context. So, for example, this very really stunning piece, which I see as really exemplifying this idea of the conceptual body, is the piece Footprints from 1976, where I see it being driven by a kind of conceptual interest in the relation between the body and urban space, the singular individual, with a name, of course, who labels her as a person, and the claiming of space. So she's literalizing the way in which, as a body in space, we, even if momentarily, we claim that space with ourselves and our identity. So the body is inherent to this exploration, which has conceptual and political implications. The first kind of theme within that, which is prompted very much by Miralles's work, is nature artifice. And this is, of course, something that Teresa highlights in the catalog essay, is this kind of toggling between the natural and the artificial, the human and the non-human. And the catalog really argues that this contains a social and political critique that has specific resonance for women under the Franco regime. So in this piece, Miralles labels it zoo images, and yet the cages are filled with domesticated animals as well as her own body. So there's a very direct critical negotiation of those divisions. Or in Translations, Woman Tree, we have the question, where does the body end and the landscape begin? Again, one of the scholars talking about this work, Maita Garbayo Maitsu, argues that the piece enacts traumatic womanhood with the female body plunged into the earth, desexualized, but also, I would argue, immobilized. So there's a sense of agency with the body in natural space, but also a sense of frustration. So I'm going to introduce works by other artists that I think kind of highlight the specificity of what Miralles is doing, and also give a context for this bigger picture of artists in other countries exploring some of the same ideas. So the British artist Richard Long explores nature artifice of the line by literally walking a line in nature. So the natural setting and the effects that his body makes in that setting become this human action of making a line, or the artifice of making art. So that's, I think, another way of thinking about this nature artifice division. the Tate Gallery argues that, or describes this piece in 1967 with Richard Long going from the city of London kind of into this weird in-between, not really rural, but suburban setting, and walking this line. So, you know, if I had more time, I'd talk about what that would mean in the British context, kind of going outside of this mega city into these interstitial areas. Body landscape is a very dramatic theme in Miralles's work. Here in this image, it's the opposite of the expected kind of bucolic relationship between the human body and the landscape. Instead, it's this very fraught, forced relationship where the artist is merging with this kind of urban suburban landscape, but there's a violence in the image. She's literally tied to the tree and again, immobilized. Here, the body modifies the landscape. As with the previous related work, the photograph is central to the final version of the work. So this is a very common strategy you'll find across Europe and North America during this period of using photography to document performative actions. So Tamara Diaz-Bringas in the catalog argues that this use of photography exemplifies the circulability of these works that I'm calling conceptual body works. So the image circulates widely and has different meanings in different sites. Celia Vara, a student whom I met in Montreal when I was teaching at McGill, coincidentally this week just sent me her dissertation on Miralles, which is a wonderful dissertation contextualizing specifically this work from the 70s in the Spanish and Catalonian context. So she argues that the tree works are linked to the brutality of Franco's regime, which of course was just coming to its end with Franco dying in 1975. Miralles performed a piece with this deformed mulberry tree, its barren form. Vara connects to bodies mutilated by the dictatorship. So this relationship of the body to public space is obviously specifically fraught in this context, especially for women who were subject to this kind of national Catholic set of rules about the behavior and comportment of women in public space. So with this piece, she also not only places this stone within the tree, but whispers something to it. And Vara actually interviewed her to find out what she whispered, but I think her main point was that other people didn't need to know what it was she was whispering. There's a kind of intimacy that she's setting up between the human and the natural that actually is very close to certain indigenous belief systems, but also to a new body of theory that's arisen in the last 20 years of feminist new materialisms, where it's considered a feminist argument to think about breaking down the human nature division, but also breaking down the hierarchies between the organic and the inorganic. Of course, Miralles did not consider herself a feminist, but I think her works, it's very difficult not to place them in a feminist context because they have such resonance within those ideas. And I thought here of the work of Valley Export, who, right around the same time is using her body in the spaces of urban Vienna and contorting it in relation to this urban landscape, with the photograph being a key aspect of formal and corporeal play. So it's the photograph that we have that marks the work as an artwork. Or in the US, actually Los Angeles context, you have Charlie Ray in a much more in a work that's much more directly contextualized in relation to the official art gallery. And as a white male artist, that kind of makes sense that he's negotiating the kind of rules about formalism and what kinds of art artists should be making, but very much keeping within the framework of the gallery. The work of Ana Mendieta is very resonant in this context as well. And the Silhouette series starts in 1973, so most of the works are also 1970s. And interestingly, her body, you can see on the left, appears within the earlier works in this series and then tends to disappear. So she's doing something very interesting about the disappearance of the body in the landscape. One of my favorite works that kind of negotiates this body landscape relation is another formerly Los Angeles artist who actually now lives in France, here making himself literally a doormat within urban space. So what does it mean for a white man to stage himself as a doormat on which people can walk? It's a very interesting project. And more recently, there's some very interesting kind of indigenous or Latinx work that is crossing over this divide between the body and the landscape. In this case, Rafa Esparza, a Los Angeles artist whose father is a very working class brick maker, makes adobe bricks. And so he works with him and then brings the bricks into the gallery space. An obvious and very key theme, which is another theme that makes Miralles's work really resonate with feminism, is that of violence and power. So most notably in the work Standard from 1976, she's tied into a wheelchair, sitting in front of these two registers of images, which complexly render expectations about women in society throughout the modern period in Spain. So Maite Garballo Metsu has argued that Standard is about violence and the female body, again, specifically under the savage Franco regime. She cites Raquel Osborne saying, during the Franco years, the female body was regarded with the support of Catholic ideology as a polluted and sinful element and as an ambit in which action had to be taken continuously. So even just the fact of appearing in a public space or appearing in a gallery as a female body in this period was highly charged. And I think that the tying of the body and constraining of it in these works by Miralles really points to that, the violence to which all people, but women in particular ways, were subjugated. So there's some very classic works that we consider feminist. And again, it's whether or not the artist stated them as feminist. They have very strong feminist effects and are seen as part of a kind of canon of feminist art, as it were. One of them is obviously Yoko Ono's Cut Piece, which enacts the violence of, in a general sense, of the male gaze towards the female performer, but also more specifically, as a Japanese woman, when she performed this in New York, it would also have a very highly charged resonance, given that it was less than 20 years after World War II. Nikita Sanfal, of course, in this early 60s, she emerges with a blast onto the art world and starts to explore through therapy, but also through her work, the violence she experienced being abused as a child by her father, and specifically produces this series of works in which she shoots canvases that have sacks of paint behind them. So the act of violence becomes the act of creativity. Or again, Valley Export, whose famous Tap and Touch cinema, where she is actualizing the violence of the male gaze by forcing the male who is gazing at her to literalize it by putting his hands into the box and grasping her body. In Vienna, again, very highly charged because of the role of Austria in World War II and what it would have meant, again, for bodies to be in public space. Or in the US context, the African-American woman artist, Adrienne Piper, who addresses the kind of micro-violence of racism and sexism by performatively handing out these cards when people offend her. So this also relates very much to the idea of relation in Miralles's work, which I'll discuss in a moment. Obviously, identity and society are key elements that tie back into the footprints work, where it's just such a brilliant example of kind of literalizing identity of the body in space. And there are many, many artists during this period who are exploring the vicissitudes of that. Lynn Hirschman, who fabricates an alter ego through self-imaging, but also through a myriad of bureaucratic and therapeutic systems, such as getting a driver's license for this fake person, substantiating Roberta Brightmore's existence. Or Ulysses Carrion, the Mexican artist who went to live in the Netherlands, who produced this piece where he tells people, he organized basically a live project about gossip, asking a group of volunteers to spread gossip about him. And the interesting thing here is that it in a way, it defines his identity in public space to tell people to talk about him. But of course, he loses control over what it is they say. So he had also other volunteers documenting the effects of this gossip. And he then makes this video where he explains the project and shows clips of the gossiping volunteers recalling their experiences with spreading gossip about him. And he points out that, you know, after he dies, this gossip about him will continue to define his identity. Questions of representation and the body are obviously circulate through all of the works of Miralles in this period. As she cites, as she herself states about these landscape works in the late 70s, quote, by separating the two components of the painting, the stretcher and canvas, and using them as elements of expression and construction, I make structures which, together with the natural elements, did not reproduce landscapes, but were landscapes in themselves. So I love this idea of like a painting of a landscape no longer becomes a representation of a landscape. It's now almost an enactment where the canvas soaks up the pigment and becomes a kind of non-representative depiction of a landscape. And representation is much more literal in the work of Eleanor Anton, who, and again, this could also be explored under the term of violence, in the sense that she's exploring the way that women's bodies are surveilled and that women internalize codes of beauty and try to conform themselves to these codes. So she did this piece over this long period of time, documented by photographs, in which she starves herself so that every day you see she's slightly smaller and closer to the beauty ideal. More recently, Castles, a trans feminist artist based in Los Angeles, kind of redid this piece based on building up the body rather than subtracting from it. So Castles is in a sense as a trans masculine person is redefining what those ideals are. Skip Arnold making his body into a sculpture. So what is representation if the body is literally there in the space of the gallery? And similarly, for very different reasons and to different effects, more recently, E.J. Hill offers his body as literal rather than representational. But it becomes de facto representational in the space of the gallery where we view it in that space of representations. And I think what was most exciting to me about Miralles's work is this literal focus on relationships and relations. I've just written a book that has a whole chapter called Relationality. So that where artists are creating works that explicitly surface the relations between artist, artwork, and audience. And here, Miralles is looking at it more in terms of the body's relation to the environment or to elements around the body that are natural, but also the body's relation to everyday actions or everyday objects. So again, there are many, many examples of artists literally exploring relationalities, such as Leisha Clark, also in the context of a dictatorship here in Brazil, where just the act of relating bodies like this becomes utopian because of the prescriptive and proscriptive aspects of the government forcing bodies to behave in a certain way under a dictatorship. And then works by Uhle, the German artist who spent most of his career in Amsterdam. This work, Fototot, which literalizes the role of the spectator by producing photographs that are unfixed. And so that when the spectators go into the gallery, it triggers the light coming on, and this destroys the images. They disappear because of the presence of the viewers. Another aspect of this piece was where he wore a kind of bodysuit of mirrors, so he reflected the viewers back on themselves. He also explored the exchange of identity between the spectator and the artist in a piece called Exchange of Identity. And then, of course, the famous works he did with Abramovich, the relation works, such as Relation in Space, 1976. There's also the beginnings of social practice work where artists are relating to the general public and public space, such as Muriel Yukola's Touch Sanitation, where she literally works to get to know every single sanitation worker in the city of New York at the time, which is an insane thing to do, and shakes every single person's hand to create a kind of bond between herself and these workers. And then reciprocally, when the audience comes to view the piece, we in turn become part of those social relationships. So yeah, I will end with this very beautiful piece by Miralles, part of the Translations or Movements series, where she's really connecting things that normally aren't connected or are not connected in this way. So she's taking turf or grass and literally bringing it into the ocean. So translating one form of land or natural landscape into another. So I would love to hear more about these from you, Teresa, but I will stop there for now so we can have a discussion. And
Bien, muchísimas gracias por este despliegue de ideas, conceptos a partir de los trabajos de Fina y sobre todo por establecer estos vínculos y relaciones respecto a las prácticas de otros artistas. Y me interesa mucho que no te has limitado precisamente a unas prácticas de los años 60 o 70, sino que has llevado a la actualidad estos paralelismos. Quizá para empezar me gustaría referirme a este último concepto que has hablado, que es el aspecto de la relacionalidad, en el sentido de que creo que este aspecto que incorpora al papel del espectador, me parece que es algo que en el caso de Fina, por ejemplo, hay una interpelación constante por su parte en el momento en que tú estás viendo sus obras. Y hay concretamente una pieza que tú has mencionado que me parece muy relevante en este sentido, que es Imatges del Zoo, Imágenes del Zoo. En esa pieza en la que ella misma se muestra en el contexto de una sala encerrada en una jaula junto con otros animales que no serían los animales que esperamos encontrar cuando visitamos un zoológico, pero tampoco son los animales que están en una exposición, en este caso, me parece que el espectador de algún modo queda inmediatamente interpelado en el sentido de que lo que está haciendo Fina también es subvertir totalmente lo que es el código de la propia obra de arte. Es decir, en este caso el concepto de autoría queda trasladado al concepto de obra y absolutamente subvertidos ambos. Por lo cual el espectador también adopta un rol que es absolutamente insospechado. No sé cómo lo ves tú en este caso, pero creo que también es una línea de trabajo que me parece interesante y que en el caso de la exposición, por ejemplo, es una pieza que yo he reforzado mucho. Es lo primero que tú encuentras cuando entras en la exposición, luego haces el recorrido y finalmente cuando sales vuelves a encontrarla como espacio de interpelación, pero también como espacio un poco de definición de una serie de ideas que van a surgir a partir de esa pieza en todo su trabajo. No sé cómo lo ves tú en este caso.
That's so exciting. And that's in fact what I think is so interesting about this relationality we start seeing across, contemporary art, even beyond the Euro-American context at this time, because several of the artists are actually Japanese and come to New York and do work there and in Japan. So, the interesting question is, what is going on in the world that artists suddenly understand that, art is a relationship and are interested in foregrounding that and in empowering spectators rather than continuing the modernist idea of art being kind of a passive relationship where an artist makes a work of art that's then just moved into an art context. And of course, people respond to it, but it's not foregrounding that process of response. And I see it very much as part of a global protest culture that occurs with the post-colonial movements, the civil rights movements in the United States. So there's bigger picture political events occurring, as well as within the art worlds, a dissatisfaction with the elitism of modernism and its narrowness. And so even in the early 50s, you have, the famous group of artists at Black Mountain College in North Carolina who are, including John Cage and Merce Cunningham and Robert Rauschenberg, and they're starting to make these events, and their famous 1952 event actually puts the audience in the middle. And of course, then, a few years later, you have the development of happenings and Fluxus. And so it's a very interesting, complex trajectory that's occurring across all these different parts of the art world. So I think that, it's too complex to have a simple answer, but I know that there is by empowering the spectator as, in a sense, a kind of co-author of the work. There's an anti-elitism, there's a generosity, there's a letting go of the kind of authoritative idea of authorship in modernism. And of course, very often the people willing to do that are women and people of color, you know, Yoko Ono being in New York, you know, so it's unusual actually when you find someone like Ule, who's a white German man, heteronormative, who's actually really interested in pushing those boundaries, because I think the real innovation is occurring among artists who are chafing at their exclusion from modernism. So, you know, I think Miralles, I don't know how much Catalonia, you know, I know that apparently they didn't have that much information about the feminist art world, for example, and things going on in the US, but still there's a dictatorship and there's information obviously about these protests going on, I'm sure, in France and Britain and so on. So it's part of this bigger picture, I think.
Estaba pensando precisamente que en este desplazamiento de la utilización del propio cuerpo como objeto, pero también como sujeto, en una exploración sobre cómo se construye esa idea de identidad que tú has mencionado y esa construcción de subjetividad que en el caso del contexto del Estado español era un contexto, como tú bien has recordado, evidentemente un contexto de una dictadura con una fuerte presencia de la religión católica, es algo que también sirve en el caso de Fina, pero de algunos artistas que tú has introducido, también sirve como elemento de reflexión respecto al poder, es decir, el poder, por supuesto, social, político, cultural, pero también ese poder que nos delimita nuestra mirada y cómo construimos nuestros imaginarios artísticos o culturales. Fina lo explora a través de diversas obras, quizá una de las más significativas en este sentido sería Matanzas, aquel proyecto que está formado por un vídeo, por unas fotomontajes, por un tríptico, pero el elemento en este caso de esta construcción de un poder que se inmiscuye en el ADN del día a día, de la cotidianidad, a través de la familia, de la religión, de la educación, creo que es algo que realmente es cierto que está fuertemente connotado en el contexto de las prácticas que sucedían en España en ese momento y especialmente en Cataluña, que fue un momento muy de experimentación, pero realmente también es cierto que es algo que compete a un ámbito mucho más amplio, que en el mundo occidental en general, incluso en otros espacios fuera del contexto europeo, norteamericano, está sucediendo. En este sentido también me parece interesante que has mencionado las prácticas de algunos artistas japoneses. Por ejemplo, yo también estaba pensando en algunos gestos de algunos de los miembros de Gutai en el momento en que utilizan su propio cuerpo para chocar contra la tela del cuadro y lo rompen, lo rasgan, lo atraviesan, que también tiene algo que ver con alguna manera cómo Fina utiliza ese lienzo y esa tela en un momento dado de una forma mucho menos agresiva quizá, pero cómo lo subvierte y vuelve a trabajar la pintura, pero desde un ángulo totalmente diferente. Esto, no sé, me parecía que era también... Has introducido algunas ideas que están bien. Y una idea que me gustaría profundizar un poco más también, cuando hablas de la violencia y el poder, has hablado del trabajo de Niki Sanfal, que me parece sumamente interesante, porque Niki Sanfal utiliza ese gesto de utilizar un arma, de disparar para crear su propia obra, ¿no? Hay una cierta también hay una ruptura de las convenciones de lo que es propiamente artístico y pictórico a la forma de entender cómo se crea una obra, en este caso cómo a través de un gesto agresivo, como es un disparo, cómo ella construye esa propia pintura. Mientras que en el caso de Fina yo creo que es quizá una violencia más estructural, una violencia más que impregna el día a día. No hay tanto un gesto de violencia, sino que hay un aspecto que está latente en la sociedad, está latente en la cultura y que cada día nos va delimitando como personas y nos constriñe. Y me parece en este sentido, no sé qué te parecerá a ti, pero por ejemplo un trabajo como Enmascarados, que son las mujeres con el rostro tapado, que es la propia mujer, en el catálogo lo puedes ver, es ella misma que hace ese gesto de sometimiento y de acatamiento. Me interesaba ese paralelismo que has establecido con el trabajo, bueno, la idea de violencia en Niki Sanfal a través de Fina, y quizá podríamos profundizar un poco más en este aspecto de la violencia, porque me parece que muchos trabajos de Fina son visualmente de una belleza enorme, pero a medida que vas profundizando en ellos, tienen muchas capas de lectura y en algunos casos emerge este aspecto.
Yes, there's almost kind of a quiet violence in Miralles' work that was really striking to me. And so it's not passive, but it's quiet. It kind of sinks in if you spend time thinking about each work. Whereas, of course, Niki de Sanfal, it's the polar opposite. So it would be interesting to conjecture that, under a, developed capitalist democracy, that feminism takes a very different form. So for Niki de Sanfal, she's emerging out of a heteronormative nuclear family of her own, and she's basically rejecting it and moving into the art world through this act of very almost spectacular violence, which in France, there's not the same kinds of restrictions. For women, however, that was an incendiary thing to do. So, there's different levels of that. I thought of too, Leisha Clark, where it's also a kind of, I wouldn't say sweet, but it's like a utopian relationality in relation to the same kind of oppressive violence of a dictatorship.
Sí, es lo que dices de Ligia Clark, esta idea de utopía, de imposibilidad de que suceda, porque, por ejemplo, esta belleza del gesto de intentar relacionar dos cuerpos, en el caso de Ligia, por ejemplo, a mí me parece interesante en la belleza que emerge a veces, por ejemplo, en una pieza que yo leo diferente a Maite, que es Dona Arbra, esa pieza de la mujer árbol, porque yo no lo veo tanto en un sentido tan negativo como de que queda como enterrada, sino que yo lo veo como una forma de emerger. Es decir, creo que el hecho de que ella se considere a sí misma como un árbol es algo que la hace sobresalir. Y me refiero un poco a precisamente este concepto de imposibilidad, de utopía, en el caso de Ligia, respecto a la belleza que emerge en muchas imágenes de Fina, como es Dona Arbra, que sin embargo no es una belleza inocua, es decir, tiene un potencial crítico muy fuerte y es algo que creo que hay que destacar también en otras artistas, como este caso que tú mencionabas de Ligia. El tema de la identidad también me interesaba mucho cuando has hablado de cómo se construye esta identidad a través del vídeo de Ulises Carrión. Ulises Carrión utiliza la calumnia, el chisme, digamos algo ajeno, ficticio, que podría ser en cierto modo un poco también algo ajeno y ficticio que es la educación que se nos impone o la religión que también se nos impone y los roles que se nos imponen. Me gustaba entrar un poco más en este tema de esa construcción de identidad y me parecía muy interesante esa lectura que tú proponías a través de esa conferencia de Ulises Carrión.
Yeah, I mean, actually, gossip isn't necessarily false, right? I mean, gossip, there are art historians such as Gavin. Sorry, that wasn't translated, so.
Sí.
Yeah, so, Gavin Butt and Irit Rogoff are art historians who actually legitimate studying gossip as a way of understanding things about history, right? So we can understand something about Carrión through gossip, but the question is, what are we understanding, right? We're understanding identity as a construction. So it definitely goes back to your point about the constructedness of identity, which under an oppressive regime where you're being, inculcated with Catholic ideology and quite extreme ideologies of gender division. And in fact, mostly I learned from Celia Vara's dissertation about the specifics of how society was told that women were supposed to have these submissive qualities, and like for Americans, like very old-fashioned ideas. And those constructions, but they become internalized, and then we behave, with the force of those constructions. So are they real? Are they false? Well, they become actual. So that's the tricky part about looking at identity, and what I love what these artists are doing, especially in the 70s, people like Lynn Hirschman, who's exploring that, but also through the role of technology. So photography, but also bureaucratic technologies of, defining personhood through getting a license. She's exploring it on all these different levels. And it seems to me that Miralles's project is much more quiet and contemplative, and kind of almost like she's taking back her ability to define herself up to a point, by deliberately placing herself in relation to the natural or in relation to everyday gestures. It's kind of a reclaiming of her selfhood, but maybe a sense of empowerment.
Sin embargo, hay un aspecto que a mí me parece también interesante, que es cierto que, por ejemplo, en esa obra que yo mencionaba, Matanzas, se está hablando de un contexto muy determinado, es un contexto dictatorial, etc. Sin embargo, hay cosas que está proponiendo que tienen vigencia, es decir, seguimos siguiendo unos modelos de educación. Estamos intentando romper los conceptos de lo que es el núcleo familiar, abrir las construcciones de identidad, pero en el fondo, si bien somos sociedades democráticas, más o menos construidas, es cierto que también se espera algo de nosotros como individuos, y que me refiero a que hay una vigencia y una actualidad de las propuestas que están diciendo. Es cierto que si leemos la obra de Fina en el contexto de los años 70, es una lectura bajo unas constricciones determinadas, pero es cierto que aún hoy hay muchas propuestas que están vigentes en estos trabajos que aún nos hacen repensar precisamente cuáles estos códigos de comportamientos que se espera de nosotros, cuál es un poco esta esta relacionalidad en función de una serie de códigos que antes podían ser quizá impuestos más imperativamente, pero que hoy quizás se imponen de otra manera menos visible, pero que está latente. No sé si tú también lo ves un poco esto.
Yeah, if I'm understanding you, because it broke up a little bit, but under late capitalist democracy, you know, we are equally inculcated, but in a much more subtle way. So there is a kind of latent, like, we think we're free. Americans are a perfect example of, you know, freedom, we're free and we can be anything we want. But of course, that in itself is an ideology that we've inhabited or that's inhabited us. So yeah, I think all of these different artistic ways of negotiating relationality, they all raise a different way of thinking about that, about how we relate to our environment, how we internalize certain bodily habitus or imperatives. And I think you could lump them all together and just interpret them in a very loose way as foregrounding the constructedness of identity, the way that we are constantly relating to ideology and other people and nature and, you know, but you could also, I think more interestingly, look at each artist within the context that they're working. You know, what does public space mean in Spain in the 1970s? Obviously something very different from what it means in the US or in Amsterdam, where Ule is working. So, you know, these things, that's just, it's not that the first way of doing it is wrong. I think it's important actually to think in big terms about how we identify ourselves and what art has to do with that. But in each case, there are very specific things going on that are impossible to completely retrieve, but are very interesting to contemplate and try to tease out.
Una de las piezas que tú también has mencionado era uno de los trabajos de Fina que a mí también me interesan mucho en relación a este concepto de cómo vincularse o cómo relacionarse respecto al espacio público, es Pisadas. Esa pieza en la que ella va caminando y a medida que va transcurriendo su andadura va dejando la impronta de su nombre en la calle, en este caso. Claro, también hay un juego que tiene que ver con ese aspecto de reconsiderar el hecho artístico, en el sentido de que lo que deja el artista cuando termina una obra es su firma, es su concepto de autoría, es en este caso está subvirtiendo absolutamente lo que es la propia cuestión del autor y la propia durabilidad de la obra, es decir, eso durará en el momento en que simplemente transcurre y luego desaparece absolutamente. Pero también conlleva, yo creo, un sentido de crítica del concepto de posesión, esa posesión que en la sociedad capitalista está totalmente asimilada y que en algunos casos construye lo que somos por lo que tenemos, no por lo que hacemos. Con lo cual también hay como un nivel crítico también implícito. No sé cómo vamos de tiempo y quizá podríamos abrir, si hay alguna pregunta, voy a ver en los chats.
There's a beautiful question in
precisamente, ¿la puedes ver? Es de Cecilia Vara, precisamente. ¿Puedes leerla? Porque creo que es una pregunta que va dirigida a ti.
Yeah, I was looking at, in terms of what you just said, in terms Celia's second question regarding relationality, what about this relation to herself? About Dona Arbra and following Teresa, reading this talk, I argued that it is through the perception process that this happens and also related to relations, such as covering with stones. Is this more an awakening than a buried action? So I mean, your relation to yourself is your relation to your environment. But some of the work is definitely more inward turning. And I think that's the quietness I was referring to. That's very different from Niki Descent Fall, you know, where it's like an action that is for other people. It's very much an articulation of her anger on a public sphere through art to make a point, is very different from the kind of valence of what I see Miralles is doing. I mean, the footprints work is just, yeah, I think it's just brilliant. It's because it functions as a deconstruction of selfhood, but also a reclaiming of it. So there's kind of a tension between questioning it, but also doing it. Like you're marking out who you are as you walk, but then by doing that, you're also leaving part of yourself behind in the environment. So I think that's what makes it brilliant, is it's not one or the other. It's kind of activating both sides of that tension, which we all live all the time. I mean, it's, you know, we might try to claim ourselves, but we're always relating to other people, even over Zoom in the pandemic.
Porque la huella que ella está dejando es su propio nombre, no es una huella, simplemente, no, por el contrario, es su propio nombre. En este sentido está también reclamando una visibilidad, que creo que también es lo que dices tú, es interesante esa dualidad, esa doble sentido de cada una de las pisadas que va haciendo en su trayecto. Yo me gustaría invitar, si alguno de las personas que están siguiéndonos se anima
Well, there's another beautiful Celia question.
¿Alguna otra?
What might feminist political action look like when it is not overtly revolutionary? So I think that's kind of what we're talking about with the idea of the quietness, right?
De la quietud, y también esta idea de cómo la belleza o la emoción también pueden tener este componente crítico radical, que creo que también es importante.
Yeah, I mean, in a context where just to be in the street as a woman was potentially, you know, dangerous, especially walking around marking your name. You know, that's a kind of, it's quiet, but it's also pretty revolutionary without announcing that. So
totalmente, y además es un gesto que está bajo sospecha en cierto modo, ¿no? Porque es esto, es utilizar que yo creo que es muy interesante la posibilidad de que sea algo negativo, pero que en cambio está transformando y reivindicando unos espacios absolutamente que hasta aquel momento no habían tenido visibilidad. Yo me gustaría aprovechar, si ya que no hay de momento ninguna otra pregunta, me gustaría que la relacionalidad, y me gustaría un poco que dos conceptos que has
yeah, she seems frozen. I can hear you, but. And there is I guess, there's a beautiful question in the chat, actually.
Perdonar, es que he perdido la conexión totalmente. Disculpad. Perdona, Amelia, que es que he perdido la conexión.
I'm here.
Sí. Decías, perdona, no sé si has oído un poco lo que te preguntaba, si era posible.
Oh, I was looking at the, someone wrote a question in our chat. about the documentary, The Silence of Others, about the victims of the Franco regime. Silence as a response to violence, to a form of grieving, and the Donna Arbor piece as an oblique reference to the myth of Daphne and Apollo, the transformation of the body as a response to violence, which, yeah, is a very beautiful way of thinking about it. So the quietness is quite specific and allows for contemplation, because you can't enact a kind of overt revolutionary act in a public space in those conditions. So it makes more sense to address it obliquely.
Disculpad porque es que no sé qué problema técnico hay, que no puedo ver ninguna de las preguntas del chat. Pero bueno, por lo menos mientras Amelia pueda atender a las respuestas, no puedo ver si hay alguna pregunta nueva o no. Me sabe mal porque no.
There is a question in the Q&A, but I can't, it's in Spanish. Do you want me to put it in the chat?
No la puedo ver, me sabe mal porque es que en mi chat no aparece ninguna pregunta. No sé si Silvia la puede ver y la puede traducir.
Can you see the chat, Teresa?
Sí, ahora sí, ahora veo aquí. Me encantó la definición que habéis formulado las dos de la obra de Fina, expresándolo como hay muchas capas para leer en esas obras de una belleza enorme de violencia silenciosa. Y nos agradece el comentario. Gracias a vosotros también. Más que una pregunta, es un comentario. Ya, es un comentario. Sí. Ahora sí, esto sí que lo puedo ver. No sé si hay alguna más. Mientras no salían preguntas, lo que te comentaba antes es si podías hablar un poco de este concepto de cuerpo conceptual con la idea de la relacionalidad que también has abordado, un poco ver cómo se imbrican estas dos ideas.
Yeah, I mean, the conceptual body idea came about after years of seeing art historians and curators separate conceptual art and performance art as if they had nothing to do with each other. So that was very frustrating to me because the work I was looking at was really conceptually driven, but using the body. And of course, I felt that that division was one way of excluding women artists and artists of color and queer artists who were using the body for very specific political reasons. And those reasons are often enacted through this foregrounding of relationality. So, you know, in a simplistic sense, if modernism was about, like I said, was about this model of making a discrete artwork that is controlled and gets put in a controlled environment for specialists to interpret it for, you know, everyday people, then obviously from the 50s onward, artists were really breaking out of that. And part of that is tied to this relationality, that it's about like empowering the audience or allowing the audience to have a role, which of course is a democratic idea, but it's revolutionary in relation to these constraints of modernism, which were functioning to maintain a kind of stratified hierarchy of authority, whether it be the artist or the critic. There were only specific kinds of people who were allowed to make art or talk about art or curate art. So I think it has all these different dimensions which relate, again, quite directly in some cases or implicitly in other cases to the rights movements and to the decolonial movements and to all the energy going on in the political sphere, which is also about empowerment and connectedness, especially in the 60s, where those discourses were really dominant in the Western democracies.
Sí. A mí me interesa mucho esta idea de empoderamiento del público, que es lo que hemos hablado antes, pero también esa como mirada que rompe esa construcción que hace el modernismo de obra finita, obra definida, y cómo, por ejemplo, la práctica, en este caso de Fina, tergiversa absolutamente esa idea, pero sobre todo decodificando aquellos estereotipos que determinan la mirada también, yo creo, porque no lo hace tanto deconstruyendo lo que es el propio objeto artístico, sino cómo nuestra percepción se transforma respecto a esto. Si bien es verdad que también una pieza como Bodegón, Naturaleza Muerta, del año 72, esa mesa en la cual presenta toda una serie de elementos que formarían parte de la naturaleza, de un paisaje, es otra manera de pintar la naturaleza, pero no su representación, como tú antes muy bien distinguías, sino a través de su propia esencia, de los propios elementos presentados uno al lado del otro. Eso creo que es un juego que es muy interesante. También me parece interesante cómo ella va trabajando en diferentes momentos esa aproximación o rechazo de la pintura más académica. No sé si lo habíamos hablado, me parece que ella hace unos estudios de bellas artes que son en aquel momento absolutamente anacrónicos y que por rechazo empieza a romper con lo que le han enseñado, pero en el fondo nunca abandona ese lenguaje de pintura tradicional, subvirtiéndolo constantemente a través de esa naturaleza del bodegón que hace en la mesa o una instalación como Naturalezas Naturales, que creo que también es interesante. Y en este sentido me ha gustado mucho la pieza que has introducido de Richard Long, esa línea que va, en este caso, porque también creo que tiene muchos paralelismos con algunas obras de Fina Miralles, y que tú contabas que tenía una lectura concreta dentro del contexto británico.
I mean, I moved to England in 2003, and I would have to really think about London in the 60s, but it was definitely a heating up art world with, you know, Antonioni and a kind of very glamorous fashion world. So, you know, it was becoming a much more vibrant global place, which of course now the British have rejected. So, but it was the beginnings of that turn towards a more global idea of contemporary art and culture. So if you look at the image, you think, oh, well, he's gone into nature. But then if you really look, like, and from what I know of England, like there is no nature left, you know. So it's a field that's actually quite, you know, it's obviously been maintained. So it might just be a park, right? But he himself described it as getting on a train at Waterloo Station and going southeast and disembarking to find a featureless field. But it's not going to be rural, right? 20 minutes outside of London. It's going to be some kind of maintained suburban landscape. So that in itself is really interesting. This isn't the 19th century landscape painters' pretense of, you know, documenting the sublime wild landscape. It's a boring English suburban, you know, probably a park. And that's kind of interesting because as a white man, he's going into this banal suburban landscape. So that's how I would read it, that it's a kind of deflation of the heroism of landscape, this in a similar way to what Miralles is doing, but I think from a very different context. He's certainly turning his back on the cosmopolitanism of London.
¿Tú crees que se podría leer como una cierta domesticación, en este caso, del espacio natural aquí, en el caso de Richard? ¿Tiene algo
Oh, absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and if you look at Long's continued work, it's always about marking himself in the, and so it's artifice, right? But the point is also that the landscape is already marked by humans. It's not natural. There is no more natural in the UK. I mean, there really isn't anywhere, but.
A mí me recuerda un poco como la otra cara del ejercicio que hace Fina en Imágenes del Zoo, que si en el centro de la sala se pone ella enjaulada con otros animales que no serían los que encontraríamos habitualmente en un zoo, todo alrededor de la sala pone el friso de fotografías de imágenes que ella precisamente realizó en el Zoo de Barcelona, con ese ejercicio como de colonialista, de apropiación de un ser natural, de una especie, de extrapolarla de su entorno y de mostrarla como algo exótico. Esa mirada de poder también en este caso, ¿no? Pero me gustaba un poco ese paralelismo entre el trabajo, la línea que traza Richard Long y un poco esa mirada que en un momento dado también se puede hacer extrapolar desde siendo justamente el ejercicio antitético de ejercer, de presentar esas otras especies fuera de su contexto. Creo que también aquí hay una lectura bastante interesante.
I mean, I think that the Miralles zoo piece is really ahead of its time because she's looking at, and this is true of all the works, the relation works with nature and trees and the ground, and because she's, I mean, I mentioned this in passing, she's relating to the natural in a way that is consonant with feminist new materialism, which is like literally 30 years later. So where feminists start realizing the value of understanding a continuum, that humans aren't just this totally separate thing that that we don't rely on the environment or the land. So it's an environmental issue, but it's also a philosophical issue. It's a shift in a way of understanding what the human is in the world. And if we understand ourselves as continuous with the land rather than as inhabiting it or marking it the way Richard Long is, then it's a very different project. So I think I'm glad that you pointed that out, because that is a striking difference actually between what she is doing and what Long is doing. Long is in a way kind of exaggerating the male creative, changing something, making a line somewhere. And in later works, he's literally going into landscapes and moving rocks, to make patterns. So he's always like doing something to the landscape. I mean, she is too de facto, but that's not what you're feeling when you're seeing those images is not, oh, she's marking the landscape. It's, oh, she is a part of the land. There's a kind of synergy between her body and the land. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to think about the difference between those two projects.
Yo estoy encantada, me está siendo un placer esta conversación. No sé si realmente tenemos más preguntas porque no puedo ver bien el chat. No sé si tú ves alguna cosa. Me sabe fatal porque me han pedido que seamos muy un poco estrictos con el tema del tiempo y yo seguiría hablando mucho tiempo porque creo que están surgiendo ideas que además a medida que vayamos reflexionando sobre las imágenes que tú nos has mostrado, las piezas que tú has introducido y los trabajos de Fina, yo creo que van a ir saliendo cosas. pero no, me parece que no nos podemos extender mucho más y tampoco veo que haya ninguna pregunta en efecto. En este caso, Amelia, darte las gracias enormes por cómo te has involucrado en esta charla, en el proyecto. Para el público que nos está escuchando, Amelia conocía el proyecto de Fina Miralles de hace tiempo porque la invité a participar en el catálogo, no fue posible por tiempos, pero estoy encantada de que no haya perdido la relación con el proyecto y hoy hayas podido estar aquí. Muchísimas, muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias por todas las sugerencias que has establecido, porque creo que a partir de aquí pueden salir muchas ideas y bueno, sabes que cuando se puedan normalizar las cosas te esperamos que puedas venir en persona a vernos en el Macba y visitar Barcelona. Nos encantará. Mil gracias por venir hoy. Gracias. Y a todas las personas...
Thank you so much.
No, of course.
Thank you for including me. It was wonderful.
Gracias a todos los que nos habéis seguido esta tarde y gracias Silvia por la paciencia en traducirnos. Espero que no haya sido muy arduo. Y bueno, despedirnos, buenas tardes y Fina Miralles, soy todas las que he sido, continúa hasta el día 5 de abril. Espero que podáis, los que no habéis tenido oportunidad, que podáis venir a ver la exposición. Gracias, buenas tardes.